Ma'am, please, could you just try this one time? I swear I'll pay you anything I have in this world. This poor baby is fading fast, and I don't know what else to do. Can you find it in your heart to nurse him just for once? The desperate cowboy pleaded, his tired eyes landing on Nora, the young woman everyone else in town ignored. She clutched the baby close to his chest, a fragile bundle of desperation. All around them, the Saturday market was bustling. The air smelled of her warm, fresh-baked bread, but underneath that, there was a coldness that felt like pure cruelty. Nora kept her head down, carefully arranging the golden loaves on her worn wooden table. Her hands moved with a quick, practiced grace, a rhythm that helped keep her grief at bay. Customers would come and go, folks she'd known her whole life, but they bought her bread without ever looking at her face. They would just point, and the coins would clatter on the table. They'd take the bread without a word. There was never any eye contact, never a simple thank you, just a heavy, painful silence that screamed louder than any words. She had been living in this silent world for 6 long weeks now, each day feeling like a year. It all started when she lost her husband, and then her own sweet baby was born into the world blue and silent. A heartbreak no person should ever have to bear, a quiet so profound it echoed in her soul. The boarding house owner said she was offering charity, but it felt more like a prison of pity. The other vendors at the market, the folks selling their jams and jellies, they never spoke to her either. The customers, her neighbors, they all pretended that she simply did not exist. She had become a ghost in her own town, completely invisible, until a sudden scream shattered the morning peace. It was a baby's wail, a sound so thin and sharp it cut right through all the market noise. It was a cry of pure desperation, a sound that made every mother's heart ache with worry. It was the sound of a life on the edge. The chattering crowd went silent and parted like the Red Sea as a man stumbled right into the middle of the town square. He was a big, broad-shouldered fella, looking like he'd wrestled a bear and lost. His face was rough with stubble, and his eyes were wild with an exhaustion that ran bone deep. His simple work shirt was stained with who knows what, and his big, calloused hands were shaking uncontrollably. In those trembling hands, he held a tiny, dirt-stained bundle of blankets. Tucked inside was a baby so small, so frighteningly still, it hardly looked real. "Please," the man begged, his voice cracked with emotion, a raw and broken sound. "Someone, please help me. She won't take a bottle." He looked around at the faces staring back at him. It has been 3 days now. The women in the crowd instinctively took a step back. The men just looked away. They all turned their backs, ashamed or unwilling to help. The baby's weak cry was now barely a whisper. With its mother gone and its own strength fading, someone, anyone, had to step forward before it was too late. She finally asked the question on everyone's mind. You could see the muscle in that man's jaw tighten up like a rope. He swallowed hard and said, "My wife. She passed on while bringing our little girl into the world. That was 3 long weeks ago." A collective gasp spread like a chill wind through the crowd of folks gathered in the market square. "I tell you," Batiste said, his voice ragged, "I have been to every single wet nurse in 3 whole counties. Every last one of them took one look at me and refused my plea. They just shut the door in my face." Over near the vegetable stand, where the tomatoes were piled high, 2 women started whispering to each other. Their voices were hushed but sharp, plenty loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "That there is Thomas Hayes. He's the same fella who got into it with the preacher, laid hands on him right on the church steps, they say. And that ain't all. He was raising a ruckus down at the saloon just last week, started a big old brawl. I heard from my cousin that he's got a temper on him that burns as hot and fast as a prairie fire. Completely wild, with no way to control it. Some folks are saying that's the real reason his poor wife passed on. Nobody was willing to go out and help her during the birthing, all on account of his mean streak. The whole town pretty much decided he was more trouble than he was worth. And now look at him. He has the nerve to stand here and expect one of us good women to help nurse his baby after all that. The way he carries on is a disgrace," one said, and with a sniff, the 2 women deliberately turned their backs. Seeing them do it, other folks in the crowd started to turn away too. Thomas heard every painful word they spoke. You could see his big, work-roughened hands clench into tight, angry fists at his sides, his knuckles turning white. That famous temper flared across his face for a moment, hot and dangerous. But then something in him changed. He glanced down at his tiny daughter, bundled in his arms, and saw the awful pale gray color of her little face. He saw her delicate skin, and he watched the weak, shallow rise and fall of her chest with each tiny breath. And in an instant, all that hot anger just crumbled away, leaving nothing but a father's crushing grief. "Please," he said. His voice came out as a broken whisper that barely carried. "She's dying. I swear on my soul, I don't know what else a man is supposed to do." Over by the bakery stall, Nora's hands froze in midair. She had been about to pick up a warm loaf of bread, but now her eyes were fixed on the baby. So very small, so tiny and struggling so hard for life. In that moment, the sight brought back a terrible memory of her own sweet daughter, her own baby girl, who she had held in her arms, so perfectly formed and silent, already gone from this world, gone before she had ever had the chance to draw her very first breath. Just then, a new voice cut through the silence. It was old Martha, the town's herb seller, who stepped forward from behind her little cart of remedies and teas. She moved with purpose, her old eyes missing nothing. She raised a wrinkled hand and pointed a finger across the square. She was pointing directly at Nora. "That one," Martha announced, her voice strong and clear. "The widow, she lost her own baby. Lost her own precious baby just a month ago. Folks were saying she might still have milk." The words hung in the dusty air, and every head in that busy market square turned to look. Thomas did not hesitate for a second. He started across that square, his worn-out leather boots feeling as heavy as lead with every single step. He was a man driven by pure, raw desperation. He finally came to a stop right there in front of her little table. As he stood over her, Nora could see him clearly now, and the sight of him just about broke her heart. She saw the deep lines of exhaustion carved right into his face, like canyons on a dried-up riverbed. There was a fire of rage in his eyes he was barely keeping a lid on, and a grief so deep it looked like it was fixing to drown him. That sorrow was pulling him under. His voice cracked as he asked, "Ma'am, can you nurse her? Just this one time? Please, I swear I will pay you anything you ask." Nora's gaze dropped from his tormented face to the tiny bundle in his arms. She looked down at that poor, fading baby, so small and so fragile. But before a single word could leave her lips, a cruel sound cut through the air. Sharp, ugly laughter erupted from a table right behind her. Nora knew who it was without even looking. It was three of those gossiping women from the boarding house. One of them sneered, "The big old widow? You are seriously asking her for help?" Bless her heart, she could not even manage to keep her own little baby alive and well. The second woman chimed in, "Imagine that, built like a milk cow and still managed to lose her own child. I tell you what, that woman is just plain cursed. Maybe she is the reason her baby is not here anymore." A third voice added, "Maybe she just rolled over and smothered the poor thing with all that weight." The words were as sharp as glass, and then the whole market seemed to erupt in that cruel laughter. Thomas spun around, his face a mask of pure fury. He faced those women, his eyes blazing with fire. His calloused hand balled up into a tight fist, and he raised it high. But just as he was about to move, Nora's hand shot out and grabbed his arm. "Don't you do it," she said, her voice firm. He froze in place. "Look down," she commanded gently. "Look at your daughter." His arm was trembling, something fierce under her touch. She could feel the storm of violence he was fighting to hold back, right there beneath her fingertips. Her hand held him steady. "Those women," she said quietly, "they are not worth the trouble." Her calm words seemed to reach him through the red haze of his anger. Slowly, so slowly, his fist unclenched, finger by finger. He took a shaky breath and turned his eyes back to Nora, his anger replaced by pleading. "Ma'am, will you please help us?" Nora did not look at the gossips. She looked at the tiny, still baby, and then up into Thomas's desperate, hope-filled eyes. His eyes were begging her, telling a story of complete desperation. "I am staying at the boarding house," she told him. "It is just 2 streets over from here. You bring that sweet baby girl there." As soon as she said it, A wave of pure relief washed over Thomas's face, so powerful it almost buckled his knees. His voice was thick with emotion. "You will really try for her?" Nora nodded once. "I will try." Thomas finally let out the breath he had been holding. He let out a long, shaky sigh, the sound of a man who had been holding his breath for what felt like days on end. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice thick with gratitude. But behind their backs, the whispers started to swirl like dust devils in a dry field. The mean-spirited gossip just exploded from the crowd. "Can you believe it? She's actually taking that stranger up to her room." "An unmarried woman," one busybody hissed to another, acting with absolutely no shame for the whole town to see. They muttered about her being a desperate, plump widow, just throwing herself at the very first man who would even look her way. The cruel words suggested she was just looking for any man at all who would pay her the slightest bit of mind. Nora, however, did not so much as turn her head. She simply continued to pack the last of her unsold bread into her basket. With her basket on her arm, she started walking with purpose away from the market square, and Thomas was right there with her. He followed her steadily, keeping a respectful distance but staying right close behind her. When they reached the steps of the old boarding house, he paused on the bottom step and cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said, "I just realized I do not even know your name." "My name is Nora," she replied softly, turning to him. "My name is Thomas Hayes," he offered, holding her kind gaze. "Thank you again, Nora, for not turning your back on us." From inside the house, the lace curtains in the front window twitched. The other young women who lived in the boarding house were all gathered, watching from the shadowy doorway of the big kitchen. Their prying eyes followed every single move. Nora paid them no mind and led Thomas up the creaking, narrow set of stairs. They climbed all the way up to her little room, the one tucked away under the slanted eaves of the attic. And just like in the market, the hateful whispers followed them up the staircase. "Just you wait. Give it an hour," one girl muttered. "You just watch," another chimed in. "He will come back down those stairs all by himself. And as for that poor little baby, well, she is probably not going to make it through the day anyway." But Nora had already reached her own door. She gently closed the wooden door behind them, shutting out their cruel world. Her room was tiny, but it was clean and peaceful. There was just a single narrow bed pushed against one wall, a simple wooden chair, and a small, cracked mirror hanging from a nail. Thomas stood awkwardly in the very center of the floor, feeling like a big, clumsy giant in such a small and quiet space. He was clutching his tiny daughter to his chest for dear life, and his eyes looked completely lost and overwhelmed by it all. "Please, sit down," Nora said in a calm, reassuring voice. She moved to take the sturdy wooden chair for herself. But instead of taking the bed, Thomas carefully knelt down on the worn floorboards right beside her chair, wanting to be closer. With the utmost care, Nora reached out her gentle arms and took the baby from him. Oh, the poor dear was so terribly light. She was far, far too light for a child her size. The little girl's eyes were sealed shut, as if she were in a deep, endless sleep. Her breathing was so faint and shallow you could barely see her tiny chest rise and fall. Without another word, Nora began to act. She started to unbutton the front of her simple, worn dress, preparing to bring the baby close to the warmth of her own skin. Gently, she nestled the frail infant against her breast, praying for a miracle to happen. For a long, tense moment, absolutely nothing happened. It was a dreadful, heart-sinking wait. Because of her own deep sorrow and loss, her own milk had very nearly dried up completely. The tiny baby's mouth, bless her heart, moved so weakly, just a faint little flutter. She was trying so hard, but each time she failed to latch on, her strength giving out. "Come on, little darling," Nora whispered, her voice thick with hope. "Please, honey, just try one more time for me." And then, like a small miracle unfolding right there, the baby finally latched on. She began to drink, drawing life into her frail little body. From across the small room, Thomas made a sound that tore through the quiet. It was half a broken sob, half a desperate gasp of air. "She's drinking," he choked out. "Oh, thank the good Lord, she's actually drinking." A flood of tears streamed down his weary face, tracking paths through the dust and worry. He didn't even try to wipe them away. He just let them fall. At the same time, Nora's own silent tears began to slip down her cheeks. It was a quiet, steady release of a pain she had held for so long. For 3 whole, agonizing weeks, her body had faithfully produced milk for a child she would never get to hold, a pain that felt endless. But in that very moment, another precious baby was going to live, all because of her own loss. The weight of it all was too much for Thomas. His legs gave out, and he just sank to the wooden floor beside her chair. His broad shoulders shook with the force of his weeping. He finally spoke, his voice ragged and torn. "I truly thought I'd lost her, Nora, just like I lost my sweet Sarah." His voice cracked. "I thought God was just taking every single thing I had left in this world." Nora didn't say a word, knowing that no words were needed. She just held the baby close and rocked her gently. She just let that sweet, hungry baby drink her fill, providing a silent, steady comfort. Outside the window, the afternoon sun slowly moved across the wide Texas sky, marking the passage of time. Inside that room, 3 people, each broken in their own way, finally found their very first moment of real, blessed peace. When the baby at last stopped drinking, her tiny belly full, she was transformed. Her skin had a healthy, warm pink glow to it, a stark difference from the pale color she had before. Her breathing was no longer shallow and faint, but steady and deep. She was fighting. Thomas looked up from the floor, his eyes full of a gratitude so profound it was humbling. "You saved her life," he said simply. His voice was filled with awe. "You brought her back to me." Nora gently, so carefully, handed the sleeping baby back to her father. "She is going to be hungry again," she said softly. "It will probably be in just a few hours." Thomas then asked, his voice hesitant, "Do you think, would it be all right if I bring her back?" He was almost afraid to hope. For a long moment, Nora hesitated, her mind racing. She could already picture the boarding house matron's face. The woman would be absolutely furious, her words as sharp as a whip. And the other girls, they would whisper and mock her without end. But then she looked at the tiny, precious life in Thomas's arms. The baby was alive, and that was all that mattered. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Yes, of course." With that one word, Thomas got to his feet, a renewed strength in his bones. He cradled his daughter against his chest, a true father once more. "I'll come back," he promised. "You can count on it." Just as he was fixing to leave before the sun went down, he stopped and turned at the door. He had one more thing to say. "You know," he started, "they were all wrong about you. Them women down at the market, always talking. You ain't cursed, not one bit." Nora looked down at her hands, unable to meet his gaze. "You don't really know that for sure." "Yes, ma'am, I do," he said, the certainty that surprised her. "I know because my little girl is alive and well. And that right there is no curse. That Miss Nora is what I'd call a true miracle." And with that, he was gone. Nora slowly sat down, all alone in her little room. It wasn't much, just 4 walls and a bed. Outside, she could hear the world carrying on without her own. The familiar sounds of the other boarding house girls filled the air, their laughter echoing down the hall. She could picture them, swapping stories and gossip, just waiting for her to make a mistake. But for the very first time in 6 long, lonely weeks, something inside Nora felt different. That feeling of being small and powerless began to fade away. She had saved a precious life. She had made a difference today. And she had a feeling that tomorrow, Thomas Hayes would be back. He wouldn't be coming back because he felt he had to, or because someone told him to. He would come back because he needed her, and her special gift. And maybe, just maybe, that was all the miracle she needed. And sure enough, as the sun set, Thomas returned. At that very moment, the boarding house girls were all gathered around the big kitchen table. They were in the middle of their evening meal when that firm, distinct knock came at the front door. Their chatter stopped on a dime. They all scattered, but not to their rooms, oh no. They crept to watch from the doorways. They peered out from the shadows as Nora opened the door. There stood Thomas on the porch. He held his tiny baby daughter, cradled gently in his strong arms, wrapped in a warm blanket. Nora could see it right away. The little girl looked so much better. Her cheeks were full and rosy. Even her little cry sounded stronger this time. "Well, it seems she's hungry again," he said with a tired smile. Nora's eyes quickly darted over to the dark hallway where she knew the girls were hiding. She could feel them watching from the shadows, their eyes sharp as pins, judging her every move. She felt their stares, but lifted her chin a little higher. She stepped back from the door. "Please, come on in." The moment he was inside, the whispering started up, like mice scurrying in the walls. "Well, I declare," one of them whispered loudly. "That's the second time today. It's just scandalous." "It is completely improper," another one added, her voice full of spite. "She's got no shame. She is practically throwing herself at that poor, grieving man." Ignoring them completely, Nora led Thomas further inside, upstairs again. Each step she took felt heavier than the last, as if she were carrying the weight of the whole world, under the weight of their sharp stares. Once she was back in the safety of her little room, she sat down and began to nurse the sweet baby, while Thomas just watched from the doorway for a spell. He finally came in and just slid down the wall, sitting on the floor with his back against it, looking all worn out. After a long moment of silence, he spoke up, his voice real low. "Nora, I need to ask you something." It was so quiet she barely heard him. She looked up from the baby, her eyes wide with curiosity. He said, "I want you to come out to my ranch, just for a few weeks, maybe, until the little one here is stronger." He rushed on. "I'll pay you proper wages, of course. A fair wage for your time and trouble. And I'll give you your very own room, a decent place to rest your head." Nora's hands, which had been rocking the baby, went completely still. He saw her hesitation and his voice filled with desperation. "Thomas, I just cannot do this alone anymore." He continued, his words tumbling out. "Riding back and forth to town twice a day is wearing me down to the bone. The whole ranch is starting to fall apart because I am never there. Lord knows I haven't slept a wink. Not for more than an hour at a time anyway. Not since my Sarah passed on." His voice cracked right in two when he said his wife's name, the pain still so fresh. It was a name full of sorrow. "I need help, Nora, real help, not just with this little angel, but with everything." Nora looked down from his troubled face to the baby in her arms, who was nursing so contentedly, oblivious to all the heartache. "The town gossips will have a field day." He let out a dry, tired laugh. "Oh, they're already talking up a storm. I reckon it'll get a whole lot worse. But you know what? I've reached the point where I just do not care one bit what any of them say." Thomas leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Not anymore. Listen to me. My dear wife. She passed away because this town, these so-called neighbors, decided I was not worth helping. They turned their backs on us, so they can think whatever awful things they want. It does not matter to me, and I am asking you, Nora. Plain and simple, will you come?" The question hung heavy in the air. Nora's mind drifted to her cold, lonely attic room. She thought about the endless mocking whispers, the soul-crushing loneliness she felt every single day. Most of all, she thought about the hard truth that she had absolutely nowhere else in the world to go. She looked into his eyes and made her choice. "I'll come." A great heavy sigh escaped from Thomas's chest, as if a massive weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Oh, thank you, Nora." The very next morning, Nora packed her little cloth bag. There was not much to put in it, just a few meager belongings she owned. She packed her one extra dress, her dear mother's old silver-backed hairbrush, and a treasured book of poetry. Bible. The girls from the boarding house lined up like crows on a wire, just watching. They filled the narrow hallway, their eyes following her every step as she came downstairs. One of them sneered, "Going off to play house with that grumpy old rancher, are we?" Another girl chimed in with a nasty laugh. "I give it a week. He'll send you packing before you know it." The first girl nodded, looking her up and down. "A girl with your build, you'll get sent right back where you came from." Just then, the matron emerged from the kitchen, wiping her greasy hands on a stained apron. She looked at Nora with cold eyes and asked, "So, you're fixin' to leave then?" Nora nodded quietly. "Yes, ma'am." The matron's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Well, there's the small matter of 3 months' room and board. That will be $50. Nora felt the blood drain from her face. A cold knot of dread formed in the pit of her stomach. She had completely forgotten. She stammered, her voice barely a whisper. The debt, I'll pay it back as soon as I can. I swear it. The matron's voice turned hard as iron. Oh, you'll pay it now or you will stay right here in this house, and you will work it off scrubbing my floors. At that very moment, Thomas appeared in the front doorway. He filled the frame, holding the tiny baby gently in his strong arms. His quiet voice cut through the tension. How much does she owe you? The matron's eyes began to gleam with pure greed. The full amount is $50, she announced. Without a single word, Thomas reached into his coat and pulled out a worn leather wallet. He showed no hesitation at all as he counted out the bills and then handed them to the stunned woman. He placed the money in her palm. Here is 60. That will more than cover her debt. And the extra will compensate you for any inconvenience you may have suffered. The matron just stared down at the cash in her hand, her mouth hanging open in shock. Thomas then turned his full attention to Nora. Your debt is paid. You are free. Let's go home. Waiting for them outside in the dusty street was a sturdy buckboard wagon. Thomas gently helped Nora up. He settled her on the wooden seat and then carefully handed her the sleeping baby. After making sure they were comfortable, he climbed up into the driver's seat himself. As the wagon began to roll away from that awful house, Nora could just hear the other girls' voices. Their jealous whispers floated on the air, fading behind them. Did you see that? Did he actually just pay off her entire debt? 60 whole dollars? For a girl like her? I reckon he must be truly desperate to do something like that. The wagon continued to roll on. It rumbled right down the middle of town. People on the sidewalk stopped and stared, and their whispers followed them like a shadow. Nora refused to look at them. She kept her chin up and her eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead. She thought to herself, these town folk are going to make your life as difficult as they can. He said, his voice quiet but full of steel. Thomas's jaw went rigid. They already did, he stated plainly. They settled that score the day they let my sweet wife die right in front of them. For a long time after that, they rode in a heavy silence. The only sounds were the creaking wagon and the endless Texas sky above. Then Thomas spoke again. Now, I have to tell you, the ranch is not much to look at right now. It is quite messy. I just have not had the heart or the time to keep up with all the chores that need doing. I can certainly help with all of that, she offered softly. He shot a quick glance over at her, his expression unreadable. I am hiring you to be a nurse for my daughter Grace, not to be my personal housekeeper. I understand that, she said, her voice firm, but I need to feel useful in this world, for more than just the one thing my body can do for your child. Thomas gave a slow, deliberate nod, and for the first time, a glimmer of true understanding was in his tired eyes. Just then, his ranch appeared over the top of a sun-baked hill. It was a much larger place than Nora had ever expected to see. From a distance, everything looked perfect, with clean, straight fences, a big sturdy barn, and a solid-looking main house. But as they rumbled closer in the wagon, she started to see the real story. Piles of unwashed laundry were stacked high on the wide wooden porch. The garden was completely lost to weeds, and chickens were running loose all over the yard. It was plain to see the entire ranch was withering away from neglect. Thomas saw her looking, and his face fell. I know it looks real bad. She shook her head. It is not bad. It is grief, plain and simple. He pulled the horses to a sudden stop in the yard and turned to look her square in the eye. He really looked, as if seeing her for the first time. Your room will be the one just off the kitchen. It was once the room for the hired hands, back when I had them. It has a good solid lock on the inside of the door. Thank you, she whispered, truly grateful. Inside the house, it was complete and utter chaos. Dishes were stacked dangerously high on every surface. A thick layer of dust covered everything like a gray blanket. Little baby things were scattered all across the main room. But underneath all the sorrow and mess, the bones of the house were good. The wooden floors were strong and wide. The windows were big. A beautiful large stone fireplace stood at one end of the room. Thomas carefully showed her to her own room. It was small, but it was spotless. It had a real bed with a quilt on it, window overlooking the pasture. It's perfect, Nora said. That evening, after nursing Grace, Nora couldn't help herself. She washed the dishes, swept the floors, folded the laundry piled on the table. Thomas came in from feeding the horses and stopped in the doorway. You didn't have to do that, I know. I hired you for Grace. Nora kept folding. I need to work. It's the only thing that keeps me from thinking about my daughter. Thomas picked up a rag and started drying dishes beside her. They worked in silence, side by side. When the kitchen was clean, Thomas made coffee, set a cup in front of Nora without asking. Thank you, she said quietly. You're good at this, taking care of things. My mother taught me before she died. And your husband? Nora's hand stilled on her coffee cup. He taught me that not all men are kind. Thomas went quiet. I'm sorry, it's over now. He's gone. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell outside. Grace slept in her cradle between them. For the first time since Sarah died, Thomas's house didn't feel empty. For the first time since her baby died, Nora felt like she belonged somewhere. As the sun began to dip low, painting the big Texas sky in fiery colors, a peaceful quiet settled over the entire ranch. But inside that little farmhouse, 3 people who had been weathered by life's storms were just starting to mend. They were beginning to heal, one slow day at a time. 2 whole weeks drifted by, and little Grace, she was just blossoming. The hollows in her cheeks filled out with healthy baby fat, and her little cries grew loud and strong, full of life. It felt like she was putting on a little more weight every single day, a beautiful, steady progress that warmed their hearts. But as Nora's own strength returned, she started to see all the other things that were suffering on the ranch. That old chicken coop, bless its heart, was looking mighty rickety, almost falling apart at the seams. The poor hens were scattered all over the yard, too stressed out to even think about laying eggs for them. And the garden, my goodness, it was a complete and utter jungle, totally taken over. It was completely overgrown with thorny weeds that were choking out any of the good, useful vegetables trying to grow. Then her eyes drifted over to the fence line near the north pasture, and her heart sank a little more. The fence posts were leaning and the wire sagged so dangerously it looked like a strong breeze could knock it all down. On top of that, the big barn roof was leaking terribly, letting rain pour in and ruin stacks of perfectly good hay. She watched Thomas work from before the sun was up until long after it set, but he was struggling. He was just one man trying to carry the heavy weight of a job meant for 2 people. He was trying to do all the work that 2 strong people would find difficult. So one morning, after she had fed little Grace, an idea took hold. After nursing the baby and putting her down for a nap, Nora marched herself straight out to that sorry-looking chicken coop. It was a real disaster inside, even worse than it looked from a distance. Most of the nesting boxes were broken and hanging off the wall. The old straw was damp and rotting. It was absolutely no wonder those poor hens were not laying a single egg. They needed a clean, safe place. She went into the barn and found an old hammer and a coffee can full of rusty nails. She grabbed some spare lumber from the barn and got right to work, determined to make things right. A good 2 hours later, she was still at it. Thomas came around the corner, a worried look on his face, wondering where she was. He stopped dead in his tracks. He just stood there, completely stunned by the sight. Nora was covered from head to toe in dust and dirt. She had feathers in her hair, but she was hammering new wooden slats into place with a steady, confident rhythm. The entire coop had been swept clean as a whistle. There was a pile of fresh, sweet-smelling straw waiting to be spread. She had already started putting clean straw in the repaired boxes, and the flock of hens already seemed to notice the change. They were clucking softly and seemed a whole lot calmer than they had in months. "Nora, what in the world are you doing?" Thomas asked in disbelief. "I'm fixing your chicken coop," she said simply, not missing a beat. He replied, "I was going to get to that eventually." "I know you were, Thomas," she said with a kind smile. "But you are just one person, and there is so much to do. You have been doing the work of 3 men all by yourself." Then she turned back and hammered one last nail in, the sound ringing with new purpose. "Just one more nail right here ought to do it. I am here now, and I certainly know what a day's work looks like." Thomas just stood there watching her as she finished up the job with a steady hand. He finally had to ask, his voice full of genuine wonder, "Where in the world did you learn to do carpentry like that?" "My daddy taught me everything he knew, long before he passed on. He said a skill is something no one can ever take from you. That was a lifetime ago, before I got married to a man who thought he had the right to tell me what I could and could not do. He used to say that a woman's hands should never, ever touch a man's tools. It just was not proper. She pushed herself up from the ground, then carefully brushed the dust and dirt from the front of her simple dress. I am not some helpless creature, Thomas. Just because I carry some extra weight does not make me useless. My size does not mean I am not capable of pulling my own weight around here. Thomas took a slow step toward her. He looked her right in the eye and said, Nora, I have never once thought you were useless. Not for a single moment. Their eyes locked for a long, quiet second. It was the first time they truly looked at each other. Something heavy and unspoken seemed to shift in the warm Texas air that hung between them. The hens, they will start laying their eggs again now, Nora said, breaking the silence with a much softer voice. Her voice was just a little quieter than before. I reckon you will have fresh eggs for breakfast by tomorrow morning. Thank you, Nora. He said it with so much gratitude. She gave a small nod and began to walk past him toward the house. But before she could get far, his hand reached out and gently caught her by the wrist. The touch was so gentle, it was a question, not a command trying to control her. Nora, he started, you do not have to do this. You do not owe me this kind of work. I know that, she replied softly. Then why did you? He asked, truly wanting to understand. She looked down at his strong hand wrapped around her wrist, noticing for the first time how it was covered in old scars. His hands told a story of a hard life, just like hers did. Because, she said, looking back up at him, for the very first time in my whole life, someone has needed me for something more than just what my body could offer a man. You actually need my help because I am a hard worker. You value what I can do. You see me as capable. Her voice started to tremble with unshed tears. Because you actually see me, Thomas. The real me. Thomas's grip on her wrist loosened just a little, but he did not let go of her completely. I do see you, Nora. I truly do. They just stood there like that in the quiet barnyard for what felt like a lifetime. A long, peaceful moment passed between them. Then the sound of little Grace's cry floated out from the open farmhouse window. The spell was broken in an instant. With a small sigh, Thomas finally released her. He turned his head toward the house and said, I will go get her. Nora simply watched him walk away. She watched him walk away, her heart just a hammering in her chest like a drum. Come the next morning, she decided it was high time to tackle that overgrown garden patch. She was down on her hands and knees, yanking out stubborn weeds that had taken over, when a couple of fellows rode up on their horses, the ranch hands Thomas had told her about. He had hired them on to get some of the fences around the property mended proper. They swung down from their saddles. Then they started stomping on over to where Thomas was standing near the barn. Nora tried her best to pay them no mind, but in the still morning air, their voices carried clear as a bell. One of them called out, Well now, looks like you got yourself some help, boss. I surely do, Thomas said. The other man let out a nasty little chuckle. She's a big woman. I bet she eats more. Than she's worth in a day's work. They both started cackling. That's when Thomas went as still as a statue. His voice came out low and flat. What was that you said? All their mean-spirited laughter died in their throats right then and there. Nothing, boss. Nothing at all. The other one quickly added, We were just making a little conversation, that was all. Thomas took a slow step toward them. Making conversation? Is that what you call it? Talking that way about the woman who saved my daughter's life? Their faces went white as a sheet. Boss, we didn't mean anything by it. Get off my land. Thomas's voice boomed like thunder. They just stared at him. What? You heard me plain. Get off my property right now. One of them tried to reason. Now come on, Thomas. Be fair. We were just having a little fun, just joking is all. Thomas took another step closer, his eyes hard as stone. His voice dropped so low it was almost a whisper, but it was more frightening than any shout. It was a dangerous sound. You come on my land, and you disrespect her. You answer directly to me. Now get, and don't you ever come back. The two men looked at each other, knowing they were beat, and then they turned to go. They got on their horses and rode off without another word. It was only then that Nora stood up. She did so slowly, brushing the dirt from her dress, but she couldn't stop her hands from shaking. He defended her again, like a lion. Later that evening, little Grace spit up a mouthful of milk, and it went all down the front of Nora's dress, her one and only good dress. Here now, don't you worry, Thomas said, coming over with a cloth. I'll help you clean it right up. I've got one of Sarah's old house dresses packed away that you can borrow. You can wear it while this one dries out proper. So they worked there together in the lamplight, standing side by side at the old wash basin, their hands splashed in the warm soapy water, and their hands were both smoothing out the worn fabric of an old quilt, feeling the history in the stitches. And then, as gentle as a whisper, their fingers brushed against each other. Lord, they both froze up like a winter pond. Neither one of them even thought about pulling away. Then Thomas, ever so slowly, brushed his thumb right across the back of her hand, right over her knuckles. It felt so deliberate, and Nora's heart skipped a beat. She knew he meant it. But just as he opened his mouth to say something, to break that heavy silence, a little cry came from the other room. Little baby Grace was waking up in her cradle. Just like that, the quiet moment between them shattered into a million pieces. Thomas quickly took a step back. He cleared his throat. I reckon I should go get her. Nora could only nod. Yes. That night was a long one. With sleep nowhere in sight, Nora found herself sitting out on the cool wooden porch steps. The old screen door creaked open behind her, a familiar sound in the stillness of the Texas night. Thomas came out and sat down right there beside her. He sat just close enough that she could feel the steady warmth radiating from him in the cool air. Can't get to sleep either, he asked, his voice low. Too much rattling around in my head tonight, she answered softly, not looking at him. They sat there for a long while, not saying a word. It was a comfortable kind of quiet as they both looked up at that big, star-filled sky. Then his voice cut through the night. My wife, she died hating me. Thomas said it so suddenly it took Nora's breath away. She turned to look straight at him. He shook his head. Well, maybe not hating me, but she died scared, and that feels a whole lot worse. He continued, she was terrified, and it was my fault. The midwife, she refused to come to the house. She wouldn't come because I'd gotten into a fight, a real bad one with the town preacher. It was just the week before that man, he'd stood up and said something he had no business saying. He said something so mean and cruel about my Sarah, and in that moment, I just saw red. My temper got the better of me, and I hit him. I hit him hard. As he spoke, his voice changed. It became hollow, like an echo from an empty place. So when Sarah's time came, nobody would help us. Not a single soul would come. She was in such terrible pain for what felt like forever. For hours and hours, she was just looking at me, begging me with her eyes to make it all stop. I held her hand so tight, Nora, but there wasn't a blessed thing I could do to help her. By the time our little Grace finally arrived, her poor mama was just too weak. She was already gone from this world. He stopped talking and just stared down at his own two hands. Sometimes, he said, his voice barely a whisper, I can't shake the feeling that she blamed me. Right there in those last precious moments, I think she blamed me for my stubborn pride, for my anger. I went and made this whole town despise us, Nora, poisoning them with enough hate to just let us slip away from this world. And without even a second thought, Nora reached over and laid her hand on his. It was a simple, comforting gesture. Now you listen to me, Thomas. You did not kill her. This town, this cruel town, is what did it. He just shook his head, refusing her comfort. No, I should have kept a lid on my temper. I should have just walked away. And that preacher should have kept a rein on his own heartless cruelty. She shot back, her voice low but firm. Her words were punctuated by a gentle squeeze of his hand, trying to share some of her own strength. You are not the bad guy in this story, Thomas. Do not ever let yourself believe you are. A deep, heavy silence fell between them, filled with unspoken pain. You know, she began, my husband, he did not die in some unfortunate accident, Nora confessed, her voice barely a whisper in the quiet night. Thomas turned to look at her fully then, his own troubles melting away as he saw the ancient sorrow in her eyes. He was drunk, mean drunk, He started laying into his horse with a strap just because the poor thing was too worn out to move another inch. Well, that horse finally had enough and it kicked him hard in the side of the head. Everyone in town went on about what a terrible tragedy it was, but I was his wife. I knew the real truth of it all. He beat that poor, defenseless animal the very same way he used to beat on me. Her voice didn't even tremble when she said it. She took a steadying breath, gathering her courage. Our little girl, she was born just 1 month after he was buried. But she came into this world silent, and her little skin was a dusky, heartbreaking blue. The doctor explained that the cord had gotten wrapped around her tiny little neck. The midwife tried to comfort me, saying these things just happen sometimes. But I always wondered. I couldn't stop wondering if all those times he struck me, if all those awful blows I took while I was carrying my baby, maybe they damaged something fragile deep down inside of me. Thomas reached out then, and with a tenderness that made her heart ache, he turned her face toward his own. Nora, you listen to me now. You did not kill your baby girl. You hear me? A cruel twist of fate did that. But it was not you. It was never you. A tear slipped down her cheek. How can you possibly know that? He looked her straight in the eye, his gaze unwavering. Because you turned around and saved mine. Those words were like a key, unlocking a door to a room inside her that had been sealed shut for years. And the tears finally came. They sat there just like that, in the quiet darkness of the porch, until the first faint hints of dawn began to paint the sky and the stars started to fade away. They were two shattered souls, discovering for the first time that maybe, just maybe, they could piece each other back together and become whole again. 3 long weeks had gone by since the day Nora had first walked up the path to that isolated little house. Out on that sprawling ranch, life was finally taking root and starting to bloom. Little baby Grace was just thriving. You could see it plain as day. She had the rosiest pink cheeks you ever did see, and a grip that would make a grown man wince. Her little fists were always clenched with a surprising strength. And let me tell you, the ranch itself was coming back to life right alongside her. The whole place had been completely transformed under Nora's watchful and determined care. The vegetable garden, once just a patch of dusty earth, was now a sight to behold. It was bursting at the seams with tomatoes, squash, and beans, producing more than they could possibly eat. The chickens were clucking happily, laying a fresh batch of brown eggs every single morning. You could count on those eggs like you could count on the sun rising. The old fences that once sagged and leaned were now standing tall and strong, a proper boundary for a proper home. And inside, the house finally felt like a real home, always warm and scrubbed clean from top to bottom. Every last corner of that place just looked brighter and felt better. But you know how it is with small towns. When things look too good, the talk starts. It happened one hot afternoon when the Texas sun was high in the sky. A fancy carriage came rolling up the lane, kicking up a cloud of dust. It was carrying 3 women from town, all dressed in their Sunday best. Thomas, bless his heart, was way out yonder checking on the north fence line. He was miles away and had no idea what kind of trouble was brewing back at the house. Nora, she was right in her element, kneeling in her garden. She was busy pulling some stubborn weeds from around her tomato plants when she heard the carriage clatter to a stop. She recognized one of them right away. It was Mrs. Henderson, the woman who ran the boarding house in town. Behind her sat the preacher's wife, looking as stern and righteous as a thundercloud. And with them was a third woman, one Nora had never laid eyes on before. This stranger's face was pinched up with a look of pure disapproval. "Miss Nora," Mrs. Henderson called out, her voice dripping with false sweetness. It was the kind of sweet that could give you a toothache, all sugary on the surface but bitter underneath. That tone was far too sweet, and Nora knew deep in her bones that it meant trouble was on its way. She got to her feet slowly, deliberately. She took her time brushing the rich garden soil from her simple work dress. "We have come all this way to speak with Mr. Hayes," Mrs. Henderson announced grandly. "Tell us, child, is he here on the property?" Nora kept her voice as steady as she could. "He is out working the north pasture, ma'am." "What a pity," the preacher's wife said, and her voice was as sharp and cutting as broken glass. She stepped forward from the carriage, as if to take charge of the whole situation. Her eyes scanned the tidy ranch with a look that was not admiration, but cold judgment. "We actually came here to warn him," she declared for all the world to hear. She paused for a moment, then added, "About you." Nora felt her stomach clench up into a tight, cold knot. The warmth of the afternoon sun seemed to vanish in an instant. "The entire town is talking," the third woman finally spoke up, her voice high and shrill, whispering in the general store, after church, everywhere. "They are talking about an unmarried woman living way out here all alone with a man. It is simply not proper." The preacher's wife chimed in, her voice full of fire and brimstone. "It is sinful, young lady, and it is a shameful disgrace." The ugly words just hung there in the still, hot air. "But I have my own room," Nora said, her voice barely a whisper against their loud accusations. She felt a desperate need to defend not just her honor, but Thomas's as well. "That does not matter one bit, dear," Mrs. Henderson said, waving a gloved hand dismissively. "What matters in this world are appearances, you see. And this whole situation, well, it appears very, very wrong to decent folk." Mrs. Henderson then began to walk around Nora, circling her slowly. She moved just like a coyote, sizing up its prey before it strikes. "We are here to take you back to the boarding house, where you rightly belong. It is for everyone's sake, you understand, before you completely tarnish what little is left of that good man's reputation." Nora stood her ground and said, "I am not going back." "Oh, you most certainly are," the woman snapped, her voice sharp as a tack. "You don't have a choice in this matter. You still have a debt." Nora shook her head. "Thomas paid my debt in full, ma'am. You know that as well as I do." "Well, if that is true, then you are simply living here as his mistress," the preacher's wife said with a sneer, "which, in this town, makes you nothing more than a—" The unspoken word hung heavy in the air, and it hit Nora just as hard as a physical slap across the face. But before she could even form a reply, the sudden loud thunder of hoofbeats came barreling down the dusty ranch road. It was the two ranch hands that Thomas had sent packing just 3 weeks before. You could tell they were both deep in their cups, drunk and full of anger, and they pulled their horses up hard right near Nora's little vegetable garden. The men were swaying so much in their saddles, it was a wonder they didn't fall off. Well now, one of them drawled out, his words thick and slurred. "Looks like the big woman has got herself some fancy company." The two church ladies gasped, their faces going pale with fright. They immediately started backing away toward the safety of their carriage. But Nora's heart was pounding like a drum, and she stood her ground. "You two need to leave right now. Thomas told you that you were fired." The first man just laughed a low, ugly sound. "Well, Thomas ain't here at the moment now, is he?" With that, he clumsily swung his leg over his horse. He stumbled when his boots hit the ground, nearly falling over. "It is just you, all by your lonesome." The second man saw his chance and climbed down from his horse as well, a wicked grin on his face. "We just came back for what we are owed," he growled, inching closer. "The boss fired us because of you. It was your fault. That little incident of yours cost us our wages." "I will pay you whatever you want to leave," Nora said, her voice trembling as she backed toward the front door of the house. The first man just shook his head slowly. "Oh, darling, we do not want your money." He showed a mouthful of yellow, crooked teeth in a nasty grin. "We are here for compensation." And then, as quick as a snake, he lunged straight for her. A terrified scream ripped from Nora's throat. The man's rough hand clamped down hard on her arm, his grip feeling like a steel trap. The foul smell of cheap whiskey on his breath nearly made her sick. Whiskey on his breath. She twisted in his grip, crying, "Let go of me." He just sneered, "Not until we get what we're owed, little lady." Just then a gunshot cracked through the quiet afternoon air like a whip. The sound echoed across the fields. Everyone froze solid, their hearts jumping into their throats. There stood Thomas, a good 20 feet away. He was just a silhouette against the sun, his rifle raised and steady, his eyes burning with a wild rage. His voice was low and dangerous, a rumbling threat. "Get your hands off of her, now." The ranch hand dropped his hold on Nora like he'd been burned. His hands shot up into the air immediately. He stammered, "Hands up, boss. We were just talking, that is all. Just a friendly conversation." Thomas took a step forward, ignoring the man's pathetic excuse. "You touched her." His voice was deadly calm. It was a terrifying Brian, the calm before a storm. "You put your filthy, grimy hands on my wife." He advanced on them slowly, each footstep deliberate and heavy on the dusty ground, the rifle never wavering. It was still aimed right at the first man's chest. "I recall telling you to never set foot on this property again. And I believe I made it perfectly clear what would happen if you ever disobeyed me." The memory of the threat hung in the air. The second man tried to speak up, his voice cracking. "Now, Thomas, hold on. We were just trying to—" "Get on your horses," Thomas commanded, cutting him off. "If I ever so much as see either of your shadows on my land again, I promise you I will not be firing a warning shot up into the sky." He let them see his finger move just slightly on the trigger, a small motion that promised a world of pain. "Next time," he said, his voice like cold steel, "I'll aim straight for your hearts." The men didn't need any more convincing. They scrambled onto their horses in a clumsy panic, kicking them into a full gallop and riding off like the devil was on their tails. They vanished in a cloud of dust. Thomas watched them go. Then slowly he lowered the heavy rifle. Nora could see that his hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer force of his protective anger. Across the yard, the town women stood watching. They were frozen by their carriage, their faces pale with shock, looking like a flock of startled hens. Thomas turned his head to face them, and the look on his face had become a mask of cold, hard fury. His voice was low and sharp. "You brought them here." He pinned Mrs. Henderson with his gaze. Mrs. Henderson's eyes went as wide as dinner plates. She sputtered, "We certainly did not. We had no idea they would do such a thing." "Don't you lie to me," Thomas snapped back. "You came here to drag her away from her own home, to make a spectacle of her. You wanted to humiliate her in front of everyone." He took a step toward them. "And while all of you were so busy spitting your poison and calling her all sorts of awful names, those two vultures over there saw their opportunity." His voice started to rise, cracking with rage. "They came here to hurt her, and it's because of you. Now you get off my land." He pointed a trembling finger toward the road. "All of you, get out of here right now." One of the women started to say, "But Mr. Hayes, we only wanted to help." Thomas roared, "Now!" The women scrambled into their carriage, nearly falling over themselves to get away. Into their carriage and fled, kicking up a cloud of dust as they tore out of there. A sudden heavy silence fell over the whole ranch. Thomas let the heavy rifle drop from his hands, the metal clattering on the hard-packed dirt. He crossed the yard to Nora in 3 long, desperate strides. His voice was rough with fear when he reached her. "Are you hurt, Nora? Tell me, did they lay a hand on you?" "I'm fine, Thomas, truly," she said, her voice a little shaky. "You got here just in time." His big, calloused hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs gently brushing her cheeks as he checked her over for any sign of injury. "I never should have left you alone out here," he said, his voice thick with regret. "This is all my fault. I should have known." "Thomas, stop that," she said, her own voice finding its strength. She reached up and grabbed onto his wrists. "I promise you, I am all right." He didn't seem to hear her, though. He just pulled her tight against his solid chest, wrapping his arms around her as if to shield her from the entire world. He held on so tight she could hardly draw a full breath into her lungs. "When I heard you scream out," he began, his voice strained, and then it just broke, full of raw emotion. "I swear, Nora, for a second I thought I had lost you for good. Just like I lost my Sarah. That thought, it nearly tore me to pieces. But I'm here," she whispered against his shirt. "I'm safe now." They stood there holding on to each other for a long, quiet moment, and she could feel the powerful, frantic pounding of his heart start right against her ear. Finally, after what felt like forever, Thomas gently loosened his grip and pulled back just enough so that he could look down into her eyes. "I just can't do this anymore, Nora." Her own breath caught in her throat, and a little knot of worry tightened inside her. "What do you mean?" she asked, almost afraid of the answer. "This," he said, his gaze intense. Pretending you're just a worker here on my ranch. Pretending I don't worry about you every minute of the day. Pretending I don't need you more than I need the very air in my lungs. His thumb gently brushed a tear from her cheek. I love you, Nora, he said, the words finally free. I'm in love with you, and I have been for a long, long time. I just can't keep hiding a feeling this strong. At his words, fresh tears, happy ones this time, spilled down her cheeks, and she smiled through them. Oh, Thomas, I love you too. Then marry me, he said, the words rushing out. Not someday way off down the road. I mean right away, before anything else in this world can possibly happen, and before anyone else out there can even think about trying to take you away from me. A soft, certain yes escaped her lips. A whispered promise. Yes, Thomas, I will. With that, he leaned down and he finally kissed her, and it was a kiss that was desperate and claiming. Like a floodgate of emotion he had been holding back for so many long weeks, had finally, wonderfully, broken wide open. When they finally parted for air, they both knew nothing would ever be the same. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing heavy, their hearts pounding in their chests. Thomas looked her straight in the eye and said with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, tomorrow. That's right, we are going into town first thing tomorrow, and we are getting married. I am done waiting around. Just then, from inside the little house, the sound of baby Grace starting to fuss reached their ears. Without a second thought, they moved as one, walking back inside to comfort the little girl together. In that moment, they were a family in every single way that mattered, a complete little unit. But come the next them, even that last little detail, the shared name, was about to change for good. The next morning, the dawn broke over the prairie, sharp and cold and crystal clear. Thomas hitched up the wagon well before the sun came up. Nora was sitting right there beside him on the wagon seat, holding little Grace, who was all bundled up and warm. The sweet baby girl was wrapped tightly in a thick wool blanket, snug and safe in her mother's arms. You feeling nervous? He asked her softly, his voice a low rumble. Or maybe just plain terrified. He reached over and took her free hand in his own calloused one. Well, me too, he admitted with a small smile. They rode on into town just as the big church bells began to ring out, calling folks to the Sunday service. The town streets were already bustling with people, more crowded than a weekday for sure. Folks were milling about everywhere you looked, all dressed up in their finest Sunday clothes. They were gathering out in the main square, visiting with neighbors after listening to the morning sermon. The steady clop of the horse's hooves slowed as Thomas's old wagon rolled to a deliberate stop. He pulled back on the reins right in the middle of the square, directly in front of the big stone courthouse. All at once, the friendly chatter and conversations seemed to just die out. Heads began to turn in their direction. It was him, that hot-headed rancher, and with him was that stout widow from out of town. Seeing them together like that, bold as brass, sent whispers racing through the crowd. The gossip spread from person to person as fast as a prairie wildfire in a dry season. Thomas swung down and helped Nora from the wagon. He kept his hand placed firmly and protectively on the small of her back as they started walking. Their destination was clear, the wide stone steps of the courthouse. That was where the circuit judge would be, since he always held court hours over the weekend for folks from out of town. The crowd of townspeople seemed to part for them, making a path while staring at them without any shame. Then a loud official voice cut right through the hushed whispers. Thomas Hayes! It was Sheriff Patterson, and he was pushing his way through the stunned crowd with a grim look on his face. And walking right there beside him, looking mighty pleased with herself, was the nosy matron from the boarding house. Thomas turned around slowly, his body tensing. Sheriff, he said, his voice flat, Mrs. Henderson has gone and filed a formal complaint. She says you are keeping this young woman here, Miss Nora, completely against her own free will. And what's more, that y'all are living in sin. Well, you can imagine the crowd pushed in even closer, just starving for a bit of juicy scandal. But Thomas, his voice was steady, dangerously calm, you might say. He said, Nora is right here because it is her choice to be. The sheriff just shook his head. That does not matter. Unmarried folks living under the same roof like that breaks a clear town ordinance, son. So you either marry her right here and now, or I have no choice but to enforce the complaint. With everyone watching, Thomas turned and looked right at Nora. That was the plan all along, wasn't it, sweetheart? She just nodded, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. Hand in hand, they climbed the big courthouse steps together, leaving the shocked crowd behind. The judge himself stood there in the doorway, looking mighty serious. He asked them, "Are you two fixing to marry now?" "Right this very minute," Thomas said, his voice firm as an old oak tree. "This is absolutely absurd," the matron sputtered out, her face all twisted up. "This is nothing but a forced marriage. Ain't nobody forcing me to do a thing," Nora said, her voice ringing out clear as a bell, as she turned to face that whole crowd. "I choose him today and every day." The judge, wasting no time, pulled out his big leather-bound book. "We are going to need some witnesses." Old Martha from the bakery pushed her way right through the crowd. "I will witness it." Then the town blacksmith stepped up beside her, his shoulders squared. "Count me in as well." The judge flipped his book open to the right page. "Thomas Hayes, my boy, do you take this woman standing beside you to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Without a moment's hesitation, he said, "I surely do." "Then, Nora, do you take this fine man as your lawfully wedded husband?" Her voice was soft but strong. "Yes, I do." "Well then, by the power vested in me by this great state, I now pronounce you husband and wife." He snapped that big book shut with a loud thud. "Go on now, son. Kiss your beautiful bride." Thomas gently cupped Nora's face between his hands, and he kissed her so sweetly. He kissed her right there on the top of the courthouse steps, not ashamed one bit, while the whole crowd just erupted in a mix of shocked gasps and a few happy cheers. When Thomas, after that kiss, he slowly pulled back and turned to face that whole gawking crowd, keeping one strong arm wrapped securely around Nora's shoulders. He held her close to his side and announced to the world, "This woman, Nora, is my wife now. We are legally married and it's all official. Does anybody here have a single problem with that?" A heavy silence fell over the town square, so thick you could cut it with a knife. Then, of course, the matron finally spoke up. "Well, that little piece of paper doesn't change the kind of woman she is." Thomas's head snapped in her direction. "You'll be careful now." Thomas cut her off right there and his voice dropped low, sounding as dangerous as a rattlesnake. "You had best watch your mouth." "You are speaking about my wife," he said, emphasizing every single word. Mrs. Henderson's face turned a shade of angry red. "This whole town knows she must have trapped you into this." "Trapped me?" Thomas scoffed. "This woman saved my little girl's life when every last one of you turned your backs and refused to help." Thomas's voice boomed across the dusty street, filled with righteous anger. "Y'all just stood there and did nothing." He continued, his voice ringing with truth. "She saved my ranch from ruin, and she saved me from myself. She saved me when I was so lost in grief that I didn't even want to wake up in the morning." He pulled Nora even closer, tucking her safely against his side. "So you are right. She is in my house. She is a part of my life. And she is in my heart to stay, and I will tell you right now, I am damn proud of that fact." A stunned silence hung in the air, but then one of the girls from the boarding house just had to shout out her poison. The young woman's voice was sharp with spite as she hollered, "You are going to regret this, Thomas. You'll see." Thomas slowly turned and fixed his hard stare right on her. "Ma'am, the only thing I could possibly regret is that a person as bitter as you will likely never understand what real love feels like. You'll never know what it is like to be loved the way I love my wife, Nora." With that settled, he finally turned his attention to the sheriff. "Sheriff Patterson, are we all done here?" Sheriff Patterson gave a short, firm nod. "Far as the law is concerned, you're married." "The complaint is officially dismissed," he declared. Thomas then gently helped a stunned Nora up into the wagon. He took up the reins, and just as they started to pull away from the crowd, he had one last thought. Thomas pulled the horses to a halt one last time, then stood up straight and tall on the wagon seat. He made sure every single person in that square could see him and hear his final warning. "Oh, and one more thing for y'all. I want to be perfectly clear. Anyone who speaks a single word of insult against my wife is insulting me directly, and anyone who even thinks about threatening her is threatening my entire family." His voice was calm now, but steady as a rock and twice as hard. And I want you all to know I protect my family. You remember that from this day forward. Then he snapped the reins and the wagon rolled away, leaving the silent townspeople standing in their dust. The long ride home had begun. The world around them went completely still and quiet. Then Thomas gently laid his calloused hand right over top of Nora's. "So, Mrs. Hay," he said, his voice low and soft as a summer breeze. She slowly turned to look up at him, her eyes questioning. "What was that?" He gave a small, honest smile. "I just wanted to hear how it sounds." She felt a real smile spread across her face, even as tears welled up. "Well, I have to admit, I surely do like the sound of that name." When they finally got back to the ranch, the big Texas sun was dipping low, painting the whole wide prairie in shades of deep orange and gold. Thomas carefully helped Nora down from the buggy, his hands steady and sure. Then he gently took little Grace from her arms. The three of them stood there together on the wooden porch, just watching the sky put on its evening show of purple and pink. "Are you truly happy, Nora?" he asked her, his voice barely a whisper against the evening sounds. Nora looked deep into his eyes, seeing the man who had been shattered by a terrible loss, but who had somehow found the strength to open his heart and learn to love again. He was the one who had chosen her, plain and simple her, right when the rest of the world decided she was not worth a second glance. "Yes, Thomas," she finally said. "I am so very happy." Thomas settled baby Grace comfortably into the crook of one arm, and then, with his other, he pulled Nora in close against his side. "That's good," he murmured into her hair, "because I plan on spending every day for the rest of my life making absolutely sure that you always stay that way." As if she understood, little Grace made a soft cooing sound in her sleep. "She is just so beautiful," Nora whispered, gazing at the baby, just like her mother was. Thomas leaned down and pressed a tender kiss to Nora's forehead. "Both of my girls are beautiful." Stepping inside, the house greeted them with a comforting warmth, the smell of a hearty stew waiting on the stove and the sound of a fire crackling in the hearth. Outside, the ranch was peaceful and beginning to thrive under their care. These two souls, once so broken, had managed to find a way to become whole again, right here with each other. A tiny, fragile baby who was not expected to live had been given a fighting chance at life. A man consumed by anger had finally found a deep and lasting peace. A woman who carried the heavy burden of shame had found her own true worth. And together, against all the odds, they had built something strong and real, something the gossip and judgment of the town could never tear down, a true family. As the first bright stars began to pop out in the vast, dark sky, they sat together on the porch swing, with baby Grace nestled safely between them, and Thomas reached over and took Nora's hand in his. He reached out and gently took Nora's hand, his thumb tracing small circles on her skin. "You know," he said softly, "we really did save each other from it all." Nora let out a contented sigh and leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling truly home. "We sure did, honey," she whispered back. And so they sat together on the old wooden porch swing, wrapped in a comfortable silence as the last light of day faded from the big Texas sky. They were just two people, a man and a woman who had been through the fire, two souls that the rest of the world had looked right past, judging them as incomplete. But against all the odds and against all that doubt, they had finally found their way to each other, and in doing so they discovered the most important truth of all. Together, they were more than enough. They were everything.